listening to Two Babies in a Business, a podcast about business, marketing, growth strategy, staff, clients, babies, and marriage. I'm Christina, and this is the lovely Peter Pilarski. We are the founders and the leaders of CIPR Communications, and we are continuing our conversation on building your marketing budget.
Yeah, and today we're going to be talking about thinking about what your growth stage is, or where you're at in terms of a company. Are you in a growth mode, or are you in a planning mode, or are you in a just work your butt off to keep your lights on mode? Because it kind of impacts the types of marketing investments and the types of marketing approaches that you might consider taking.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me about growth, and we've kind of heard this from multiple, I think, mentors and people that we look up to over the course of building our business, is like growth comes in stages, right? So, there are definite growth stages within your company that, you're feeling that kind of upward motion. There are definite periods where you feel more of a plateau. I think most people can relate, especially looking back at 2020, that there are stages where it's, stop the bleeding. But one thing, I actually remember this from the WSI conference 2 years ago. And we were talking about, I think the presentation was called Highway to Heaven. And so it was about, growing to a certain amount of revenue per year. And, obviously the growth chart for this individual's business was, upward trend if you zoomed out. But if you zoomed in on that, it was kind of that jagged line, right? The ups, the downs, the kind of plateaus, and generally that line increased because his business grew. But zooming in on those particular stages of his business where, okay, things went up, but then they dropped a little bit, and then they plateaued for a bit, and then they went up, and so, again, from just building a business perspective, things are always changing and moving, but it's important to really be hyper aware of what stage you're actually in.
Yeah. And I'd say it's like, you're, as much as many businesses would like to be in hyper growth all the time, that's not really a desirable thing, right? So you may grow to a certain point, and then you probably need to kind of take your foot off the gas pedal a little bit, and then sort of reassess and do some internal planning and internal restructuring, sort of get your business ready to, to do the next set of growth, right? Because if you're just growth all the time, it's possible, and businesses do it, but you might burn out employees, you might have people you might start creating a lot of inefficiencies, you might lose your processes and systems, right? So, it sort of goes like Christina says, like it's sort of, your growth line might go like this, but your business is sort of doing this, right? I'm using my hands in an audio podcast. But anyways, my point is that you might have like plateaus where you need to make some readjustments happen in your business, and that's more of a planning phase. In terms of your budget, though, when it comes
I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to just say one last thing about like the business aspect of growth, is that like, being together in this business for what'll this be, our 7th year, kind of full time at it. The business has obviously existed longer than that, but I think now, maybe even last year before, we started to really understand the growth trends month by month.
Right.
So we know as a company that certain months are expected lower revenue than others.
Yeah.
We know when the greatest potential for big growth is from a quarterly perspective. So, even, I consider us to be in a very high growth stage right now, but even month to month, we know what stage of that growth we're in, and we can plan from a marketing budget perspective. Okay, we know this month's lower. Instinctually, you might go, okay, well, then our budget should be lower. But actually, those are the months that we more heavily invest to make sure that we're not, right, that we're feeding the beast later on. And so even understanding that growth from a month to month changes. And I think a lot of companies and clients that we have too, they go, oh, we're down from last month. And more sophisticated marketing programs. I'm going to call out Steve from Last Frontier Heliskiing. He is awesome at always looking at year to year, right? So how did I look last December versus this December? Because you know the kind of trends within those months are the same. And it's the same with our business. So I just wanted to add that. Okay, marketing, go.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're thinking about your marketing budget and your growth stage, if you're in a high growth mode type stage, you might be looking at things that sort of generate, top line revenue at a faster rate. More of those quick win type marketing strategies and techniques. You're probably going to take a little bit more of an iterative approach in terms of, okay, what do we need to do? Rather than sort of starting over with a new website, you may need to be iterating on your website, making incremental adjustments to sort of make it change over time, because they're probably in a high growth mode phase. Isn't time to sort of, just like take 3 or 4 months to kind of start something brand new and really take the time to kind of think through it in a lot of detail. Whereas if you're more of a planning stage, that's where, it's more of a steady, take the long view. Maybe you're doing more tactics like earned media, maybe you're doing more brand building at that time. Getting some PR type of activities. Maybe that's when you're focused more on inbound content marketing and SEO. I always sort of make the argument that you should be doing both. But it's really about kind of the allocation of your budget. Maybe if you're in a high growth budget, maybe 70% of your budget's allocated to those quicker win techniques and 30% is, looking at the long term. And then when you're in a planning phase, maybe it's a reverse. Maybe 70% is like on building your foundation, making sure that your infrastructure is strong, making sure your processes and systems are strong, you're doing those long-term things. And maybe just a smaller part of your budget is allocated to those sort of quicker win type techniques. So that's, I think, a good way to think about it. And I think that, your budget might fluctuate from period to period. And it might be that you're in a 2-year growth phase and then, you're in a planning phase, or it might be like Christina said, like in our business, like there's certain months of the year, like the summer in our business is a slower time because people are just gone and they don't want to be working on big new marketing projects. So that's a good time for us to be kind of, working on our case studies and working on our content and working on our, improving our website or whatever it is we need to be doing internally to sort of get ready for the next high growth phase, which really, starts in September for us type of thing. So
I have a question for you.
Yes.
So we often internally and with clients talk about 2 different kinds of marketing tactics. So like lead generation tactics and brand reputation or brand awareness tactics. So where do you see those fitting and focusing depending on a growth stage? And for people listening, brand awareness and brand reputation is obviously brand building and getting your name out there and making sure you have a positive brand reputation in the marketplace. And lead gen is obviously exactly that, generating more leads, driving sales.
Yeah, so kind of, again, that's very consistent with what I just said, in the sense that, like, maybe if you're in a high growth mode, a lot of your budget's focused towards more that lead generation side of things, right? It's just more sales. And then if you're in a more of a planning phase, that's maybe when you're doing a little bit more of that, reputation management, a little bit more focus on that reputation management. But I think that a business should be doing both all the time. And so it's not really necessarily one or the other. It's just what is your allocation of budget based on kind of where you're at as a business, right? So that's how I would answer that question. And I think that's a really good holistic view of marketing and business building. I think that's the path to the best success. And so then it's just, again, like I said, an allocation of budget at a time, depending on what's going on, right? So, again, I mean, maybe, I'll use an example of, a PR campaign we just did for a client, West Coast Seeds, where, they decided to do, it's not necessarily a busy time of year for them in terms of sales, because, they sell stuff that people often buy in the winter, or in the summer, I should say, more. And so they decided to do a giving campaign, and they did a big PR campaign and a marketing push around a charitable giving kind of strategy that they had. Got tremendous national brand recognition, got lots of love online because of what they did. Really successful campaign. And I mean, I think they also sold some product. So it sort of like
Lots.
fit both things. But it was really a brand building exercise. And, they're an interesting company because they're very well known across the country, and we did the work for them. And I had so many people being like, man, I love these guys. This is so great what they're doing. Like, just reminded me, I can't wait to get my brochure and make my order for next year. You know what I mean? And so it was sort of a brand building exercise, but it was sort of perfect to be top of mind for people as they start to think about maybe their garden for next year or their, whatever. So it was sort of well timed on that business cycle side of things. And then obviously when it's time to make sales, a company like that probably, and I don't know for sure, but a company like that probably does a huge percentage of their sales in a short period of time. It's like, that's not the time to be building a new website and thinking about new strategies or whatever. That's the time to make sales, right? And so it's sort of, when it rains, you gotta get it. You gotta go for it.
Yeah. So I guess in summary, where you're at in your growth from a company perspective needs to also demonstrate kind of, and I guess feed into one, your marketing spend, so your marketing budget, but also what tactics you're deploying when. So I actually like the example of a website. Maybe we would rebuild our website in the summer months because we have the time and capacity to do it, and we know people aren't around, so they're not necessarily searching for us online. So that's a good time to allocate a marketing budget for that in those months. Same with West Coast Seeds, great brand building activities. Don't throw those into your hugely already busy marketing times, but spread them out in different ways. And I think my one thing I would want to remind people before we wrap up is, just because you're in a month or a season or a stage that doesn't feel as high growth doesn't mean less budget. I think often it means the opposite, because you're trying to fill a funnel or you're trying to get yourself out there a little bit more, or it means you have more time to do some of those marketing projects. So I think something interesting to consider from that perspective too, that might be a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, the other stage that we didn't really hit on or talk about is that kind of stop the bleeding stage. But I think some of that is obviously intuitive and,
Yeah. And I'll just say that I think people undervalue brand building and the value of that brand building brings to a business. And so, getting out there, doing PR, figuring out some kind of giving campaign, just being a good business person or a good sort of corporate citizen and sort of doing some things to showcase that has a lot of value. And that is value. And that's, before we talked about marketing as an investment, that is a major investment into the value of your brand long term. And that stuff is actually very invaluable. And I think people don't necessarily understand that because it's not as easily tied to like a direct sale. That's, we call that the air game, right? So it's sort of like the air game is sort of this is sort of our political backgrounds, but sort of the big, get yourself out there in the air, the advertise, the brand building, and then the ground game is really that executing the tactical stuff that gets you the sales. So both are important.
I think the best demonstration of really successful brands are when your kids know what they are by looking at a logo. We drove by, I don't know, we were on a drive somewhere with the kids on the weekend, somewhere we'd never been before, and there was a Starbucks, and our kids obviously can't read yet, but they saw the big Starbucks logo, and Jacob said, "Look, a Starbucks, there's a Starbucks here.
I want a chocolate muffin," right? So
I want a chocolate chip muffin.
Our kids are bigger spenders at Starbucks than we are because of the good brand building that they've done, and they're right. I mean, it's a great example.
Yeah, so I think that brand building side, again, not something is easy to assign a metric to, but from that kind of qualitative perspective, the big brands that have spent millions of dollars investing in their brand and making sure that it's prevalent in the marketplace.
And there's a reason they're the most successful companies in the world.
It's true. And I think about smaller brands too that our kids recognize, but do that, have a little quiz with your kids in terms of what brands they know in the community or not. You can kind of see that to come to fruition. But no, it's true. you can't undervalue that brand side.
Yeah. Good.
Well,
Thanks for the chat.
Anytime.
3, 2, 1.